We have a lot of people here. So firstly, I'd like to ask how many people of you can speak Chinese? 谢谢. How many of you can speak Japanese? Nope. How many of you can speak Russian? Спасибо. Yeah. So I'm Zhaoxu, a student at the University of Oregon, and I'm glad to introduce my current thesis research to you guys. Oh. Yeah. So has anybody looked at the news recently? The situation in Israel, Palestine is really intense right now, and many maps were being used in social media and newspapers as well. I'm not judging whether those maps are true or wrong, but instead whether those maps could convince the audience. Here's a map titled The Loss of Palestine Territories with a strong color contrast between green and white. Now, if I change the colors to black and white, how does that make it different? How does that make it more persuasive or not? How about adding a label called fiction on the left of the map? Does that deprive the credibility of the map? So these diversified map designs also appear in the reference maps. The different choices of colors, borders, and labels definitely influence people's perceptions of the complex geopolitical issue. So it's clear and obvious the maps are heavily used in the political contested regions such as Eastern Ukraine and Middle East, featuring the role as rhetorical devices. Map can also be the cognitive inputs conveying certain information and arguments. And sometimes people use maps to do fact checks for some controversial topics. And in the scenario of political disputed areas, borders, field colors, and toponyms, which are place names, already conveying a lot of messages. Depending on the cases, there are multiple narratives behind the decision makings of those features. So in order to better navigate the role of maps in political contested regions, I developed a case study focusing on Sakhalin Island, and investigating how the political persuasive mapping being presented to viewers with different cultural backgrounds. After answering the specific components, I will use these design combinations answering the following questions, which are basically how trustworthy are those designs to the map viewers, and what can we learn from that? So persuasive mapping was primarily developed by the Ian Muhlenhaus as a framework to systematically examine the visual communications between maps and audiences. In his PhD dissertation, he did a comprehensive content analysis on 250 maps and clustered those maps into 4 categories. Later, he improved the model of persuasive maps and conducted an online survey and analyzed whether those designs will change the map viewers' opinions. I also looked at many toponymy research in the political contested regions, such as Nagorno-Karabakh, EC, or Sea of Japan, and tried to bring those toponymic literatures into my research. So why Sakhalin is a case? Well, surprisingly, Sakhalin Island is or was an underrated center of geopolitical tension between multiple powers since 17th century. I will give a 60-second history class on Sakhalin. So Sakhalin was loosely influenced by Chinese empires until Russian and Japanese imperialists came in and compete with each other on 19th century. And it was the southern part of the island was once a part of Japan between 1905 and 1945. At the end of World War II, Soviet army advanced and occupied the whole island again, but Japanese still refused to recognize the Russians' legitimacy on the southern half of the island. So it is really diverse and interesting situation right here in Sakhalin. Every actors have their own arguments, narratives here. Russia is a current de jure and de facto controller. Japan didn't claim it, but questioned about Russia's legitimacy, and China has historical claims over their historical textbooks and the maps. It's definitely not a normal case that both sides demanding the sovereignty of the same territory like Falkland Island or the Isla Malvinas. But that Sakhalin case gave me opportunities to find more interesting designing choices that cartographers make. So using consistent keywords in 4 different languages in certain websites that are being used in English, Japanese, Chinese, and Russian audience, which is a small chart on the top right. I sampled convenience sampling. I sampled 200 online maps on the internet that at least feature Sakhalin maps in debate for my piloting study, which also means I will improve my sampling method in the future. Be careful, the languages or the scripts are not a factor in my sample collection. So these are Chinese maps. These are the English maps. And these are Japanese ones. These are Russian ones. So I put all those 4 categories maps into a giant pot. Yeah. With those maps here, I ready for quantitative content analysis. I adopted the codes from the Ian Millhouse pieces in 2010, where he divided all the components into data manipulations and graphic manipulations. I altered a lot, especially break the graphic manipulations into 4 categories: borders, fill colors, toponyms, and other graphical manipulations. Because my title here is a Japanese labeling, so I will only address the toponyms right here. So before we dive into that, we have to acknowledge the linguistic diversity in this particular geopolitical area. On the left, there are codes addressing on the scripts and languages of the places that featured on the map. Scripts refer to the written text systems, such as Chinese characters, Latin scripts, Japanese kanas, or Russian Cyrillic, whereas languages refer to more as a phonetical aspects, like how to pronounce a place. In this case, there are 3 names of the island in 3 languages. In Chinese, it's Kuyedao. In Japanese, it's Karafuto. In Russian, it's Ostrov Sakhalin or Ostrov Sakhalinsky. Correct me if that's wrong. So let's take a look at the results. Firstly, the majority of maps have labeling on Sakhalin Island, but there is a pattern here. Sakhalin is labeled more on the Japanese and Cyrillic maps referring to Russia and Japan with vital interests in the Sakhalin contemporary context. And also, here is a relationship between the languages and scripts depicted on the maps. There are 2 charts on the right using the same data but swapped axes. So you can notice that Russian and Japanese can be transcribed into multiple scripts, such as Cyrillic, Japanese kanas, Japanese kanjis, and Latin scripts. However, Chinese is really isolated. Most Chinese place names can be only found on the maps in the Chinese scripts. Sometimes we do see cartographers label multiple names for a single place. In this case, the scenario is definitely more significant for Japanese kanjis and Japanese katakanas. So as what the map on the right shows, where Japanese cartographers put both Japanese katakana transcriptions for Russian, Japanese kanjis for Japanese names in the bracket, and Russian Cyrillics on the second line. 3 names for a single place. So here's a brief summary of the statistics. Definitely, local scripts are preferred for their intended audiences, but prevalence of Russian and Japanese languages were found. Even Japanese is arguing about Russian legitimacy. They still use a lot of Russian names, their local names in some degrees. So this is how Japanese maps label Sakhalin Island. Also, regarding to the map context, it's quite confident to say that the types of those maps basically match the geopolitical narratives of each country. For example, Russia gives me a lot of military maps to justify their narratives on reuniting Sakhalin. Japanese maps focus more on the contemporary context. Chinese use more historical maps. And English maps have the most diverse categories since they are bysiders of the whole issue here. Other significant findings: only 2 of 200 maps featuring the native groups of the people on the island, the Ainu people here. However, over half of the 200 maps featuring the political control of the island with a retrospective imperialist perspective. Individual human figures were not discovered on those maps, and the larger minority group on the island, Sakhalin Koreans, are also ignored in those maps. So current conclusions are as follows. Cartography representations on borders, field colors, although I didn't discuss these 2 factors here, but they do vary in cultural contexts on the online maps of Sakhalin. In specific, toponyms were manipulated in certain degrees, but Indo-names, which is Russia local names, are also represented in English and Japanese maps, even with the current conflicts. Historical maps of the Sakhalin are primarily used in Russia and China for advancing historical legitimacy. So how does this piece connect to the persuasive mapping? So several intakes. So the first one is I shift the focus to the contested territories, and also I use a framework in the different cultural contexts, and which are referring to different languages and scripts in my work. I'm also trying to extend my scope to reference maps and the field of toponymy, bridging and putting all those pieces together. Future directions, I'll finish my content analysis, and basically there are a lot of directions that can go from there. How realistic to fit the maps into Millen House models, how to do a test whether those designs convince people or not on an imagined territorial dispute. And in the end, the larger picture on how can we better to evaluate maps to question territorial claims that have biases. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I know it's a lot. I will specifically thanks to my advisor, Dr. Carolyn Fish, who helped me a lot on crafting those stuffs. I will put my slides on the Slack channel, and please let me know if you have any questions, specific questions and thoughts or frameworks that can help to improve my thesis so far. Thank you so much.